Welcome to Illuminate. We are talking about research in teaching and learning in higher education, also known as Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or SoTL research. So my name is Richelle Marynowski. I'm a faculty member at the University of Lethbridge in the Faculty of Education. So I do work on teaching and learning not only in K-12 systems, but also in post-secondary. So my research in my post-secondary teaching centers around student engagement and classroom spaces. I'm here today with Jansen, also from the University of Lethbridge. Harold, do you want to introduce yourself and talk about your SoTL research?
Well, my name is Jansen. I am a professor of political science and chair of the political science department. Most of my research has nothing to do with scholarship on teaching and learning, but I do a little bit on the side that mostly grows out of reflection on my own teaching, and I've presented on things like the impact of flipped classrooms on student learning, the organizational culture around classrooms and what that does to university administration. I presented that work at places like the Prairie Political Science Association, the Canadian Political Science Association, University of Calgary's Conference on Teaching and Learning, but also on the International Society for Scholarship on Teaching and Learning.
Excellent. So I'm intrigued about the administration part of that. So could you talk a little bit more about the impact on administration?
Well, so Dave Hinger and I did a presentation at the International Conference in October, and what we looked at was, I've been part of a project here at the university that's been running for several years called the LEAP project, the Learning Environment Evaluation Project. You've been involved in that as well. And so we were talking about the changes that we'd seen in the way universities were, at least our university, was becoming much more conscious of the impact of space on the quality of teaching and the quality of the student experience, their ability to learn and engage with the material. And so we basically did some reflection on the changes we'd seen in terms of organizational structure, but also just in terms of culture, the kinds of battles I've been having, or now decreased battles I have with the dean's office. So I'm trying to get specific classrooms for me and for my department. And so we talked about that a little bit. So it was more of an organizational behavior kind of presentation rather than specifically focused on student learning and achievement.
Right, and so that really makes sense because it's the organizational structures and ways of assigning classrooms, and if we want a particular space and find that we work best in a particular space. One of the projects that I worked on with the Teaching Center was taking a look at students in two different classroom spaces. One that was the scale-up classroom and one that was a regular classroom. And I would prefer to teach in the scale-up classroom always because it supports the structure that I put in my classes. However, that's not always possible. In particular, in the Faculty of Education, we teach 3-hour classes. And to block a 3-hour time slot in that room, we got just feedback from the registrar's office that it's not optimizing the space. And so in order to optimize space, you don't necessarily get matched up with the space that works best for you.
Yeah, and that's a big issue I run into, and a lot of times what we found in the past, before there was more attention being drawn to the importance of classrooms, is everything was driven by room size. So I'd have professors who would want to teach very active learning kind of strategies being put in lecture theaters, and then I'd have students, or I'd have faculty members who'd have a class, maybe there were only 17 people, and they want to lecture and they're being put in a seminar room because, well, that's the room size, right? So everything was being driven by room size, and we've seen that shift. And so that's really what we were reflecting on in the research. And I mean, the challenge is sort of how generalizable is that outside of a particular context. It's one case study, but there was a lot of interest from, there are people around the world, there are a lot of people from Australia who have been fighting similar battles, and I don't know if you've found that as well, that there seems to be this increased realization that classrooms make a difference, that physical space matters.
It really does. I was at a conference last year at McGill, and we were in one of their education spaces, and it was not really a scale-up classroom in that intent, but there were whiteboard surfaces all over the place, and there was movable whiteboards, and there was ability to connect, and it was just a beautiful space. I was so inspired by being in there, even just to attend a session, never mind presenting in there or teaching in there. Right. And I do know that Australia, for sure, particularly even in the K-12 research, parallels our work quite a bit. And I have done some work with some post-secondaries in that area.
Well, it's one of the things that struck me about the SoTL community is that lots of different people, we're all struggling with the same kind of questions, and that increasingly there's more of this opportunity to share what we're doing, and I found that very important. I remember one time I was one of the early teaching sessions here at the university, I went and did a presentation, and Jan Newberry from anthropology department also did a presentation, and we had been doing exactly the same experiment in our classrooms, and we didn't find out till we both presented on exactly the same thing at the same session. So I think it's very important to have those conversations instead of everybody reinventing the wheel. Let's learn from each other, and that really is what sort of science and research is supposed to be about, not everybody starting from scratch, but build on each other's knowledge to sort of advance the field of study. And so I see a lot of growth in that, both within the institution and outside, and I think that's very important.
And acceptance of SoTL research as important research and as a research field, regardless of whether it's in your academic area or not, but it's about the research of teaching and learning. And I think that's really key. If that's not what we're here for, is to support learning.
Yeah, there's a bit of a tension for those of us, for you, because you're an education prof, right? That overlap is much easier, right? But for me, it's not the main thing I do, right? I've always thought critical reflection on teaching is just an important part about being a professional in this job, and so I've always done that. I'm always reflecting what's working, what's not. But for me, it's a bit analogous to me as a political scientist, right? I expect everybody who sort of votes to critically look at their citizenship activities, but I don't expect everybody to sit and do surveys of voters and do very carefully structured studies on how politics works, right? That's sort of my job. So, I mean, one of the things that I've observed is for those of us sort of outside education, it is more challenging to do this as a main focus of research, and it still isn't accepted quite as much as other kinds of research. Even though I do think it obviously has value and is important.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good point. That the acceptance of the research side of looking at teaching and learning in your area. So do you find that you have support from colleagues, or do you have support? I guess you're chair now, so you would have support from your chair to do that kind of work. But what about others in the faculty then?
So, for example, within my department, I mean, my colleagues generally are sort of critically looking at things, but I'm the only one who sort of has presented on this in a regular sort of way at conferences or things like that. And it's a pretty small group when I go to, say, the Canadian Political Science Association, the teaching and learning parts. It's not that we're in huge rooms. There might be 10 to 15 people at a well-attended session, although I did organize the very first ever session on teaching at the Canadian Political Science Association. It was amazing. We had 50 people out for that one. But it sort of dwindled off a little bit. But we learned from each other, and there's a lot of things that sort of spread secondhand, right? I mean, the fact that I sort of stay up on this and participate in this means when my colleagues come to questions, I can reflect on things that I've learned. So there's sort of that secondary spin-off benefit. So I'm not sure I'd want or necessarily need all my colleagues to be doing this, but I would like people to look at what the research tells you in terms of structuring your own teaching. I increasingly draw on that. If I have an idea about teaching, will that work or not? Well, maybe someone's researched it and can save me going down a really bad path, right? Because somebody tried this and they wrote it up and said, no, don't do that. That's a really bad idea. I have this idea for a course, and yesterday I actually spent some time. I actually found this journal I didn't know existed, the Journal of Political Science Education. I just found it. Nice. And somebody had written an article on the thing I was thinking of doing, right? And that's pretty cool to find that. So I think there's a lot of benefit in increased use of SoTL for all of us, whether you actually do the research yourself or not.
Though then finding those sources, like you said, you didn't even know this journal existed or this source existed. So I think that's key as well, is recognizing that there are places out there where we can find support for the work we're wanting to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I found it thanks to a Google search, amazingly enough. What is this journal? How have I never heard of this? It was pretty astonishing.
That's awesome. So one of the things that you had mentioned right at the beginning was taking a look at flipped classrooms. So there are many different models about flipped classrooms. And so what is your model of a flipped classroom, or your, I guess, definition of a flipped classroom?
Well, I do the sort of the classic model where I produced videos. I spent one whole term, basically, I felt like all I did in my life was edit video and film video and talk to a webcam and produce these videos, and I produced animations. I dove in deep into this, and the students watch the videos, and then they come to class, and I don't say anything. I just, here's the activity, you know what it is. When you have questions, come and ask me, and they can help each other out. So that's what I did. So fairly traditional. The idea is that they work on their own, but the prep, the sort of one-way delivery of material is done through video, and I like that because the students can go back and rewatch things, and I often see them in class, right? They'll have the computer where they're doing their work, and they'll often have their phone with the video on it, right? Winding to the part that they didn't understand, or to re-see how to do something, or when they're preparing for the exam, they can go back, right? And rewatch parts of the video. And I've done follow-up studies then with my students, like, so how did you use the videos? How many did you watch? Did you go back and rewatch any? Like, just to find out how they're actually using it. And find, yeah, a large number of them actually do go back and rewatch, right? And that's what I hope would happen.
That's impressive. Thinking about that experience, did you then survey the students about whether they found that an effective way to learn or effective way to use class time?
So what I'm interested in is, like, I think a lot of the times the kind of research we do is whether students sort of like it or find it effective. And I mean, all other things being equal, I'd like them to like what they're doing, but I'm more interested that they're learning what I want them to learn.
Right.
And right, I mean, they'd probably like it if I handed out candy every week, right? I'm sure they would like that very much and respond very positively to that. But I'm not convinced that's going to necessarily help them learn. So actually what I did is I actually looked at sort of how they do on the exam before and after, right? So I've got the exam structured exactly the same way, and did they actually perform better? And I actually saw a 10% increase in how they did, which is, from the little bit I understand about educational research, it's a fairly significant increase to get for a switch in pedagogical technique. But I have started surveying now about sort of what they did, because I can change things, but there's so many variables that go into how a student does, right? There's classes can vary from year to year, just the sort of relative strength or weakness of students. It can be the time slot, it can be all kinds of things, and it can be just the amount of work they put into it. So I've become increasingly interested in understanding what they're doing, right? And part of me, and I actually then can compare sort of what they tell me about what they did versus how well they did, and I can sort of get a sense of, well, what strategies, what can I tell them that they could do to help them perform better as well. Part of the problem that I have, though, is a lot of times when I have a good idea about teaching, I just will run ahead and try the idea, and then I don't have pre-data, right, to compare the post to, right? So I've just got the data at the end. And maybe that's due to my teaching, but maybe if I'd done the survey before, well, they are already doing well on all these scores. So that's often the problem I have, but I don't want to say, I've got this great idea that I'm convinced would be great, but I'm not going to do it for a year and make the students suffer through the old way, just so I can gather good data. That's something I always struggle with.
I completely appreciate that. I also go into finding an idea and then running with it and then realizing after the fact, shoot, I should have.
I have no baseline data, right? Exactly.
Now I don't know what to do with that. I have my perceptions and I have student perceptions and I have how they did, but I don't have any beginning data to do a comparison with.
Yeah, no, exactly, and that's a big kind of issue. And the other issue I really struggle with, and these are sort of my biases as somebody who does research method, and I do a lot of survey research where sample size is a really big thing for me, right? And I often don't know, what do I do with a sample of 30, right? I really struggle with that, like how representative is that?
Right.
I'm used to dealing with samples of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, right, where I'm getting statistical significance, and I can let the math tell me whether it's important or not. So I really do struggle with that, right, is that we're dealing with really small n's. And so how meaningful are the numbers I'm finding? So that's why gathering data over time is helpful, because you can pool that and build a bigger data set. But in the meantime, right, I keep thinking of new things to change, and I'm always constantly incrementing and changing my teaching, and then that reduces the comparability from one year to the other. So I'm sort of torn between sometimes trying to be the most effective teacher and being even the most effective solo researcher, right? Those things are sometimes actually at tension.
Yes, I can see that. And definitely when you tweak one thing, that has impacts beyond of what you even think they might have an impact beyond. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I did a presentation at Spark, our teaching conference, about this, right? I made one change to one part of the course, which had this spillover effect in completely changing how students approach another part of the class that I didn't anticipate or even want, frankly, and it had some very negative effects for some of the students, and that was, I'm very struck by, it's just this, it's like Jenga, right? You pull the one block out and everything else gets affected, and you hope it doesn't collapse, but sometimes it does. And that's a challenge, and it's a challenge from a researcher in trying to relate the effect of one variable to another. All the variables are intertwined, and a minor change can have a huge impact.
What got you started thinking about changing your teaching or wanting to take a look at a flipped classroom?
Mostly just dissatisfaction with my students not doing well. I wasn't happy with their level of achievement. And it's really easy to sit and blame the students, and students bear responsibility for their learning, but I'm also the instructor, and my first thing is always look at, am I doing everything I can?
Right.
That's the first place I look before I blame them. So it actually was serendipity, the flipped classroom. I was on study leave, and I'm supposed to be focusing on research, but because I don't have the pressure, I don't have meetings to go to, which frees up a lot of time. I was reading Wired magazine of all things, and there's an article about the Khan Academy and that's, I'd never heard of this before, and a little light bulb went off. This could really work, right? And it was partly because I teach the stats side, and I have very math-phobic students in political science. And so that little light bulb went off that this could really work. And then, but I mean, I wasn't going to just take it on an article in Wired magazine. So I actually dug up some research to see, and I found actually some educational research that no, this actually could be quite effective. And then so I thought, well, I'll try it and see how it went. And yeah, there was a time about halfway through where my entire life is producing video, as I said, that I regretted it. But then when I saw, then I carefully compared. I had all the exam data from the previous year. I always kept the different questions separate. I'd always stored that. And so the parts where I'd flipped, I could see the improvement. And I actually could see a demonstrable improvement in how they did. And I saw it anecdotally. I saw increased confidence in the way they were approaching their final assignment. They were wanting to tackle more complicated questions than in the past, which indicated to me a degree of confidence that I was observing. But I was very interested in, okay, the final same questions, it's not subjective, and the answers are right or wrong. And they did actually do better, and that was very encouraging, actually, to me. So.
Right, and so interesting with the Khan Academy being in the magazine, and that's something that's been known in like K-12 circles for quite a while, and it's just fascinating the story of, teaching, I think it was his cousin or something, and how it just blossomed from there. And so what I'm finding is doing the videos even, you have to be really thoughtful about what you're saying through the video and being able to edit and cut out pieces. And I think there's a difference, I think I'd be more precise in the material that I'm presenting, and that I get kind of to the point faster. Because I know about 8 minutes, I think, in a video is what they're going to pay attention to at a given time. Is that something that you...
well, I found my early ones, and I mean, if I had the energy, I would go back and redo them all. But I found they got shorter over time because the first time I approached this, I found the way I dealt with it was very much like talking to a classroom, right? And then you'll say something, and then you'll say it again to make sure that they get it. And then just to make sure that they know this is really the point that they want to take away, you say it again, and I do that in videos. But in video, you can do it once, and maybe if you really want to hit it, you can put a little bit of text on the bottom to really hit it home. And if they didn't understand it, they can go back and rewatch it, right? And so my videos got shorter and much more to the point over time. And one of the things I found out from my students is a lot of them would sort of watch them on faster speed, right? Which indicates to me, right?
Okay.
So I talk to them a lot. Like I'm always, in any class I do, always talking to them, trying to get feedback constantly. What's working, what's not. And so I was finding this out from them that they found that's what they were doing, and that really said something to me that I need to be more concise and to the point. So yeah, that's something I absolutely learned. Mine are longer, but they have a theory component and then an applied component, how to do it in the stats section.
Right.
And,
I guess it makes sense on what you're trying to get them to learn.
Yeah, and it depends
right?
on it depends on doing something reasonably complex, and then some of the more complicated techniques, they need to be longer than some of the ones that are fairly simple, right, and that build on previous material.
So it's interesting with the flipped classroom and research into the flipped classroom, I have had students say to me, well, but then you're not teaching me. And so I'm wondering so you're the teacher, you're supposed to be the one teaching me in this time frame. Have you had any feedback on that?
No, actually, where I've gotten feedback from other faculty members on this. I actually did a presentation to the Faculty of Arts and Science Council and got pushback from someone that essentially I was unemploying professors. And I said, like they were saying, you could just produce this video, you could show it across the entire province and just have grad students do this. And I said, I said, some of the very best teaching I've ever done is that one-on-one help where I have to explain it to somebody a different way because they couldn't understand it from the video. Or they've run into this problem in the lab they're doing, and stepping back and trying to figure out a way to get them to see that they do know the solution, right? And I've had to think on my feet. And I think that sort of sells that kind of teaching very short. With the students, part of what I've done when I've done something different, I often will use SoTL research to justify and tell them what I'm doing. I'll say, there's a lot of research. I know this is going to be unusual for you, but there's research that shows that you will learn better and you will do better on the exam, and you're going to learn this material and be more confident in it. I said, so this may seem unusual, but the research tells us this is going to work, so bear with me. So I actually used the research to actually get buy-in from them. I find that very effective, actually.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm thinking about the students that I'm teaching, and they're going to be future teachers. And so we're trying to model for them ways that they can engage students in thinking about the
Or use this
material.
whole meta kind of thing to
Yeah,
your sort of
trying,
teacher.
right?
Yeah.
But what's so frustrating then is when they, because we model, we talk about it, we debrief it, we get them to practice it, and then when they go into their practical experiences out there in the schools, it's like, I stand and lecture for 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And so it's so frustrating to be modeling what we would consider effective practice and then it not be taken up as a way for them to also engage in their practice.
The reality, though, for a lot of us, even though research can show us that there are better ways or more effective ways of doing things, the reality, lecture is a lot easier. Like when I'm spending 20 hours a week producing videos, I think, oh, it'd be just so much easier to sit in front of a class and just tell you all this rather than figure out how can I create a little animation that's going to show this. And I'm annotating all these things that I'm doing on the screen capture I've done on the software program. This would be just so much easier to sit in front of a class and do it.
Right.
But I know it's less effective, right? And that's, again, where the research tells me, no, instead, like, keep on track, right, that this will work. And also, there is suspicion in a lot of other places from other colleagues and from students. And a lot of times, students are remarkably conservative and traditional, because I do ask them in the follow-up studies that I do, like, do you like this? And there's a few students who would much rather I lecture at them and would much rather do the homework at home. They're very wedded to traditional models. And one other thing that I did based on research that I'd read was switch the way I was using PowerPoint or presentation software, like to get away from the terrible bullet point slides. And I was observing the deadening effect it was having on my classroom. And so I did a bit of research on what's effective, and the research shows the less that's on the slides, the more they will remember of them, right? So few words that's just going to hit the key point. I treat it like this is the bold on what I'm saying. That's how I always view the slides. But boy, students hate that. They really want to have the slides on Moodle so they can just download them, read them, copy everything down in class, check Facebook on their computer, wait till the next slide comes up. They like that. They're used to that.
Yeah.
I'm really quite struck by how conservative students are in terms of the kind of pedagogies they respond to.
I have gotten quite a bit of resistance. I use active pedagogies in my class,
Yes.
so moving students around a lot, getting them to talk to each other quite a bit, getting them to engage with the ideas in class as opposed to listening and taking notes. It's interesting to watch them figure out how to behave in a class like that, because they like to get their notebook open and their pen ready and they're going to start writing and there's nothing for them to write.
Yeah.
Because it's like, now get up, now talk to your neighbor, now let's synthesize this. I'll write some stuff on the board that may or may not make sense to you, or then you can write it down later, but it's irrelevant. And so I have gotten a little bit of resistance saying, can you just please let us sit still and listen for a while?
Yeah.
And I'm, okay, fine, but understand that this is why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
And so then drawing on research to say, no, this is important to get you discussing the ideas, to get you digging deeper into the topics, learning from each other so that we can come to a better shared knowledge as opposed to my knowledge. And so I know that you had been working a little bit with some active pedagogies. So do you mind talking through a little bit about that?
Yeah, so some of the work that we've been doing is like I've been having more and more group activities where I'd get them to work on something together or produce something. Part of the research I've done is actually getting students to reflect then on sort of the role they took in groups, because one of the problems in groups is that students they develop relationships over time, and there's some positive parts about that. It builds a sense of community. I've noticed classes where I do that, attendance and engagement is higher, so it has some very positive community benefits. But I was concerned with some students that it was impacting their student learning and their individual learning, because in the end, when I'm giving an exam, ultimately I want you to be able to know how to do this, right? Not you are part of a group that collectively knew how to do this. You need to be able to do this. So I asked students sort of what roles they took. So in their groups, did they mostly explain things? Did they usually explain things? Did they usually learn from others? Did they almost always learn from others? And found there's a fairly significant relationship between that and how they did on the exam. That students who tended to take more of an explanation role tended to do better. And there were some students where if they took very more passive kind of roles, they were just so concerned with going along with what the group said that that they weren't actually learning themselves. They didn't want to rock the boat. And so they would just dutifully enter the wrong answer, the right answer, even though they didn't understand why that was the right answer. And so I'd observed this anecdotally, and so I was concerned, which is why we designed the survey very carefully to look at how widespread was this problem. We actually found, what we were anecdotally observing was borne out by the evidence in terms of how they did on the exam. So it led us to make some changes on that. Now, that doesn't mean that groups are necessarily bad. It could say something about the way I did groups. And for some of the groups worked very well. There were just particular dynamics in some groups over the mix of personalities that you had that could be fairly detrimental. So, I mean, the conclusion is not that groups are bad. The conclusion that some particular groups can, in certain circumstances, get in the way of individual student learning. The other thing I really struggle with, and I know this because I often do surveys of my students at the beginning of class just to understand where they're coming from, is different people learn in different ways, and a lot of people really like to learn on their own. Much happier doing that and don't really want to be part of groups, that sort of very more solitary pursuit of knowledge. And I get that because I'm that kind of learner. I'm exactly that person. Whereas other people very much like to work collaboratively and learn best by talking through ideas with others. So it's trying to come up with ways that you meet sort of all these diverse needs in the classroom, and that's really the big struggle to me is how do you deal with that?
So I was talking to, so after seeing your session at Spark,
Right.
and you talking about asking the students about whether they like to contribute, whether they don't like to contribute, the pre-information that you got from them about group making. A colleague came to me and asked about, so how should I make groups for this class that I'm going to be teaching? And so I talked to him about your experience and that students were trying to figure out what role they were filling in the group. And I thought that was really interesting, and I shared that with him, and he had said that kind of makes sense. So if you ask them particular information, then they wonder what characteristic that you're drawing on that made them go in this.
And they feel like they have to fulfill that role, right? It's almost the stuff, and that's, I mean, in research, that's one of the big issues, right? It's when we design surveys, we have these really big problems because if I ask something early, I can prime the responses later, right? And this is exactly it. I've now keyed them into the fact that if you said, oh, I really like to be the note taker in a group, that you're going to feel that that's what you need to do. And that really wasn't the point. I'm just trying to get a diversity of skills, right?
Right.
And so it was very interesting to observe that. I noticed the very first meeting, that was one of the first things they tried to figure out is how they'd answered that survey and why they were in the group together. It was
funny.
really interesting. Yeah.
So when he and I talked then, he's like, okay, so I don't really want that.
No.
So I talked that I always do random groups and I own it and I say they're random and groups will change. And so if you don't like the people you're with or don't work well with the people you're with right now, we will change groups and I will assign you to groups. And so then we also talked about the students that don't like to work in groups and how sometimes we have to push them beyond. And again, part of that is being in an education faculty where we're pushing them beyond and showing them how to push students beyond their comfortable and not always but allowing them to sit in their comfort zone. But then sometimes, can we let students opt out of the group that day? Is today a day where you are choosing to just be on your own and that being okay? So there was a little bit of that
because you're always using decks of cards, giving them a joker card they can cash in once in a while, right? So today, is this the day you're going to cash in your opt-out card? Right.
And if you want to do that, that's great. And so recognize that there are some days where we just don't feel like talking to other people, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's a very effective way to do things. I think that's one of the conclusions from the research that I did. I think that idea of mixing up the groups more regularly just to disrupt some of the unhealthy patterns that can have. And so if you have a table that's not working, but then that's partly at the expense of the community side, right? And that's what a lot of the research is telling me. There's always trade-offs, right? The gains you make in one area can be offset by some unintended consequences in others. And yeah, I'm not sure how to deal with that. Like one of the things I've observed in the flipped classroom is that I'm finding a lot of students who are struggling, and consistently the students who are struggling are ones for whom English is a second language. I've really noticed that. I can't see why watching video would make that worse than listening to a lecture, because a video you can at least rewind, right, if you didn't catch something. But I think what's happening that's different is I'm helping the students one-on-one more. So I'm seeing where they're struggling much more. So I think I'm just more aware of it, not that it's necessarily worse. And again, that can be sort of an artifact of testing, right? Because if you're on the stuff where you're being innovative, you're asking all these questions and you're finding all the problems, but we're not doing the same thing in classrooms that are more traditionally structured. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means you just don't have data for the other parts of it.
Right, so that's an interesting thing is when you change the structure of your classroom, there's things that pop up that you notice that you wouldn't have noticed before. And I think that's really key, that when you say you're talking, now are able to talk to the students more one-on-one, you're noticing some individual differences or some groups of people that maybe didn't get their needs met in this instance. So now you're seeing an even bigger struggle. Now I'm not meeting these people's needs, but now I'm meeting these people's needs. And how do I negotiate
and
that?
I'm increasingly struck with these students, and some of them I'd spend an extra 45 minutes after class staying with them, helping them to get through the lab. But I mean, it's made me think more about sort of broader institutional policies around the extent to which we're preparing students for whom English is not their first language to actually succeed, right? They're clearly passing tests that qualify, but how adequate those tests are to actually assess people's ability to function well and succeed at university. I have some questions about that that's sort of arisen from this.
Yeah, that's really important work, because considering when too we're looking at international students and even the demographics of our community changing.
Absolutely.
And communities changing in general, that there's a lot of movement between communities. There are those challenges that we need to take a look at and pay attention to.
Absolutely.
You know, amongst all the other challenges.
Yes, we have very few challenges. So.
Well, we are at the end of our time here, Harold. I really appreciate the conversations that we've had this morning. And thank you so much for sharing your SoTL research.
Thank you very much, Richelle.